Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Newsmax Prime. I'm Rick Blackwell, filling in for J.D. Hayworth. Of prime interest tonight, tears and questions as family and friends mourn the loss of 4 Marines gunned down at a Tennessee recruiting center. The 4 unarmed Marines were killed yesterday when a gunman opened fire at the reserve center in Chattanooga. Meanwhile, U.S. authorities turned their attention to the suspect, Mohammed Youssef Abdulaziz, and the trips he made to both Jordan and possibly Yemen last year. Did he turn to radical Islam while overseas? Still a lot of unknown about yesterday's attack, but calls for arming our military members at recruiting centers are growing, as is the question, are more of these lone wolf attacks on the horizon?
This matter continues to be investigated as an act of terrorism by the FBI's Knoxville Joint Terrorism Task Force, along with the Chattanooga Police Department and our other federal, state, and local partners. Because the investigation is still in its early stages, it would be premature to speculate on exactly why the shooter did what he did. However, we are conducting a thorough investigation to determine whether this person acted alone, was inspired or directed, and will exhaust all efforts in determining how and why this horrible act happened.
Well, for more on this story, let's welcome in Frank Gaffney, founder and president of the Center for Security Policy, and also former INS officer Michael Cutler. Welcome to you both, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us right here on Newsmax Prime. Frank, the investigation continues. We are still learning about the gunman, Abdulaziz, but do you worry we're going to be seeing more Islamic terrorism in the United States?
What we're seeing is jihad. It is a global movement. It is not just being conducted by the Islamic State, or for that matter, the country that President Obama is determined to obtain a nuclear weapon, the Iranian Islamic Republic. It is being brought to us by all kinds of groups, including notably the Muslim Brotherhood, which the President has again embraced. The trouble is that these aren't lone wolves, that they're not people who have been radicalized to some sort of lunatic fringe. These are individual jihadists acting in furtherance of a shared agenda, namely Islamic supremacism. And they're doing it in a manner that is consistent with the teachings of authoritative Islam as codified in a doctrine they call Sharia. And unless and until we get our heads around those realities, I'm afraid we're going to see a lot more of this, not only elsewhere around the world, but here as well.
Well, Michael, you've been writing about immigration and security really for some time, connecting the dots in many cases with these two issues. Abdulaziz, reportedly a naturalized citizen, this allowed him with 2 passports to pretty much travel where he wanted. Is this a case, an example of failed American policy?
Absolutely. Look, if you look at the 9/11 Commission report, and you know I provided testimony to the 9/11 Commission, we've seen failure after failure. 6 months after 9/11, in fact, I testified at a hearing before the House Immigration Subcommittee about how 2 of the dead terrorists, Mohammed Atta and Marwan al-Shehhi, could have been granted flight status or student visas to attend flight training 6 months after the attacks. The world knew they were dead, knew they were terrorists, but we continue to do dumb things. Just this past February, Liban Haji Mohammed, a Somalian, was put on the FBI's most wanted list of terrorists. This guy was another naturalized citizen. The concern, he was driving a cab all over Washington, D.C. for years, had an intimate familiarity with it. We just had another terrorist in Ohio arrested, acquired U.S. citizenship, and specifically spoke to his brother by electronic means, talking about how he was getting citizenship so he could get a U.S. passport to facilitate his travel to Syria. You had Faisal Shahzad, the terrorist that was involved with trying to set off the SUV in Times Square, naturalized months before the attack. The judge at sentencing said, wait a minute, we just gave you an oath of citizenship. And he just blandly looked at her and said, yeah, I lied. We've seen this time and again. You saw it with the Tsarnaev brothers up in Boston. One was a citizen, one had applied for citizenship. There's no scrutiny to the process. There's no integrity to the process where we're giving these folks the keys to America's front door, and that's a big problem.
And Frank, it seems like these American passports are making it easier for these terrorists. Talk about that issue a little bit.
Well, I think irrespective of what passport they're using, whether it's American, whether it's French or other European passports, whether it's in the Middle East, these are folks who have shown themselves adept at getting themselves into countries either through licit or illicit means. One particular concern for me is we're bringing lots of people in through a refugee resettlement program that is, I'm afraid, conferring upon them legal resident status that they can exploit, as we've seen Somalis do. And my colleague has mentioned some examples of that. We have people who are coming in quite probably across our border or underneath it through drug smuggling tunnels that are also likely to be jihadists using perhaps even weapons of mass destruction against us. We have got to recognize we are at war, and the war is now very much here on the home front. They're targeting our military personnel and their families. They're targeting our law enforcement personnel and their families, and they, of course, are targeting the general population as well.
Well, Michael, we're naturalizing 500,000 citizens. It puts us at risk. How do we change the policy? What needs to be done to sort of help our law enforcement officers do their job more effectively?
Well, any conversation about comprehensive reform, and in fact, a while back, I called it the Terrorist Assistance and Facilitation Act. Senator Sessions quoted me from the floor of the Senate during the floor debates back in 2007. There's got to be integrity to the process. The 9/11 Commission recognized that immigration fraud and visa fraud were the key issues. And what was so frustrating for me, especially on 9/11, living here in New York, witnessing it up close and in person, the attacks, 4.5 years earlier, I had testified before a congressional hearing before the House Subcommittee on Immigration and Border Security on the issue of visa fraud, immigration fraud. We have an administration that's totally out of control. We have sanctuary cities enabling illegal aliens whose identities and purposes for coming here are unknown and unknowable, hiding in plain sight. The dreamers, hundreds of thousands, have been given identity documents without an interview. We have a visa waiver program that we keep expanding. We're up to 38 countries because of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And when I listen to politicians, whether it's Hillary Clinton, Bernard Sanders, saying, well, we need to give the immigrants citizenship, and they're talking about illegal aliens, that makes about as much sense as providing the key to the front door for the guy that just broke in, for the burglar. So there's got to be integrity to the immigration system, and if we err, we have to err on the side of national security and public safety, wouldn't you think?
Well, can I add one point to that?
So much, yeah, go ahead, Frank.
Just very quickly, I couldn't agree more. And the thing is, of course, they're not just getting identity papers, they're also, in many cases, being given a ready route to getting the vote. And that's, of course, where a lot of the interest comes from on the part of Hillary Clinton, I think, and others. One other question here is the conduct of the investigation into this Abdulaziz fellow is now in the hands of a U.S. attorney who, as I understand it, was at the commissioning ceremony, or whatever you want to call it, the dedication of the mosque in Chattanooga, at which this fellow may well have been radicalized. It seems to me he ought to recuse himself from this investigation. The policy problems we've been talking about suggest he won't get it right in the first place. It's not consistent with administration party lining on this. But even if this is to be done in a manner that actually is focused on the facts, this doesn't sound like a guy who's going to be comfortable with where the facts lead.
And
if
Frank,
it leads back to that mosque.
We're going to have to leave it right there. Great insight from Michael Cutler and Frank Gaffney from Washington, D.C. Thanks to both you gentlemen. As always, we want to hear from you on this issue. And, of course, you can just send us an email. And we're going to have much more here on Newsmax TV. A retired U.S. Army Major General calls the shootings in Chattanooga a failing of this president and our government. Why he's criticizing President Obama. Donald Trump continues to criticize the president and fellow Republicans, and he continues to lead in the latest Republican poll. We break down the new numbers and look at whether the Trump brand is hurting the GOP. And a man who knows business says gay marriage is bad for business. That and more when Newsmax Prime continues.